A late autumn evening in the big city brought with it cold and strong winds. Dim streetlights cast trembling yellow patches of light on the deserted streets, while buildings that were once full of life stood dark and grim. Between the display windows of closed shops and abandoned structures, the only movement came from a few passers-by hurrying home, shielding their faces from the cold. On one such corner sat Nick Peters, a black man enduring tough times, trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. Nick had once been an ordinary worker, hard-working and reliable. In his youth, he worked for a large construction company, building office buildings, residential complexes, and participating in community projects. He took pride in his work and the sense of being part of something meaningful. But as he aged, life threw relentless challenges his way. After a series of layoffs and the closure of the company he had worked for in recent years, Nick found himself unemployed. The economy took years to recover, and finding a new job in such a competitive environment proved nearly impossible, especially for a black man his age without a university degree. Nick lost his home when he could no longer afford the rent. He moved into cheap rooms, only to wake up one day to find that the rent had gone up again. Eventually, with just a backpack of belongings and no clear plan, he ended up on the streets. He knew he had become just another statistic in a society that chose not to see people like him. The homeless were avoided. People walked by, turning their heads away as though their presence disrupted the order of things. And today was no different. People steered clear of Nick, avoiding eye contact. He sat on the cold pavement near an old abandoned warehouse. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but at least it was relatively quiet, and the wind didn't cut through as harshly. Nick wrapped himself in an old, worn-out jacket that had long since lost its ability to keep him warm, but was his only protection against the freezing wind. He was tired and hungry, but knew that even a little sleep might help him escape his misery, if only temporarily. That was all he could hope for. However, Nick didn't get even a moment of reprieve. Across the street, a police officer appeared. Officer Edward Johnson, a white man who had been patrolling the area for years, was known for his tough reputation. He had little tolerance for anyone he deemed a threat to order. To him, it didn't matter that people like Nick ended up in dire situations through no fault of their own. Johnson saw them as a threat to public order, as those who disrupted the peace of decent citizens. When Officer Johnson spotted Nick sitting by the wall, he immediately decided to intervene. He approached with heavy, confident steps, feeling his authority and ready to restore order. He didn't care for explanations. It didn't matter to him that this man wasn't breaking any laws. For Johnson, it was enough that Nick was here on the street, out of place. As the officer drew closer, his expression grew even more disdainful. He looked over Nick, his worn-out jacket, his exhausted face, his eyes full of weariness and sorrow. To Johnson, all he saw was weakness, a lack of will to live, something he believed deserved nothing but contempt. He kicked Nick in the side, trying to force him to get up and leave. Nick stumbled, losing his balance, but tried to get to his feet, knowing that resisting would only make things worse. His body, accustomed to cold nights and lack of food, was weak, and every effort felt nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Officer Johnson continued to watch him, his arrogance unhidden. He knew no one would stand up for this man. Nick wasn't someone society valued. He was just another homeless person most people preferred to ignore. Johnson felt power over people like Nick and used it to assert his superiority. But Johnson didn't notice that a woman across the street was watching the entire scene unfold. Haley Reed, a social worker heading home after another long workday, had noticed what was happening. She had worked for years with people in difficult circumstances and knew how tough the fight was for those like Nick. She didn't see just a homeless man. She saw a person brought to his knees by the system, but who hadn't been broken. She couldn't walk away without intervening. Haley took out her phone and began recording. She saw the expression on Johnson's face: indifference, smugness, and a sense of impunity. She knew that in situations like this, only capturing the incident on camera could stop such actions and bring attention to the issue. She didn't know how things would unfold, but was determined to help Nick, even if it meant angering the officer. And so, the evening that had begun in despair and loneliness for Nick suddenly took a different turn. He knew his fate had always been in the hands of the system, but for the first time, someone from the outside decided to step in. Haley Reed, a young woman in her early 30s, was a social worker who had dedicated her life to helping those who had fallen through the cracks. Her daily work often involved meeting people who had no money, no shelter, and no support. She understood how unfair the system could be, how often those on the streets were unable to escape the vicious cycle of injustice, bias, and indifference. She also knew that people were often judged by their appearance, with no regard for the hardships they had endured. Haley was heading home after a long and exhausting day when she saw the scene unfolding on the street. She pulled her car over to the curb to take a closer look. She saw a police officer, Edward Johnson, approach a homeless man sitting near an old warehouse. Without any attempt at conversation, the officer immediately acted aggressively. She saw Officer Johnson kick the man, causing him to fall, and her heart filled with pain and outrage. What was happening before her eyes was a blatant act of injustice. Haley couldn't stand idly by. She knew that this man, like so many other homeless individuals, didn't deserve such treatment simply because he lacked a home and stability. She saw the humiliation inflicted upon him just for being out of place. She felt she had to do something to help, and realized that the best way to act in the moment was to document what was happening on video. She took out her phone and began recording everything that was happening on the street. At first, she stayed in her car, trying to remain unnoticed so the officer wouldn't stop his actions upon seeing the camera. But when Johnson kicked the man a second time, Haley couldn't hold back. She got out of her car and approached them. She wanted the man lying on the ground to know that his suffering had not gone unnoticed, that there were people who cared. She moved closer and raised her voice while continuing to record, intending to draw the officer's attention. Johnson frowned as he noticed her. Haley could see his irritation, but she wasn't about to back down. She stood her ground, confidently holding her phone despite the tense situation. Officer Johnson continued to glare at her, but realizing that his actions were being recorded, he slowed down and finally backed off, casting one last disdainful look at Nick before leaving. Nick lay on the ground, feeling both the physical pain of the blow and the emotional humiliation. He had grown used to being ignored, used to being invisible. But in that moment, when he saw that someone hadn't walked past him, that someone was willing to stand up for him, he felt a mix of surprise and gratitude tinged with disbelief. Could someone truly want to help him? That question lingered in his mind as he struggled to his feet with Haley's help. Haley helped Nick stand and made sure he was as okay as he could be in his condition. She asked him where he planned to go and if he needed help. Nick, though embarrassed and slightly bewildered, realized he had no other option. He was grateful for her intervention, but knew the situation was far from resolved. He felt pain, both physical and emotional, and for a moment he thought it would have been easier if he had just walked away and avoided the entire situation. But now, standing before Haley, he realized he no longer wanted to hide and remain silent. Haley offered to help Nick find temporary shelter where he could spend the night in safety, but Nick refused. He felt ashamed to accept help and was used to the idea that no one would assist him without hidden motives. However, Haley wasn't going to let it end there. She knew what had happened was wrong and understood that if no action was taken, Officer Johnson would go unpunished and continue treating others the same way. She convinced Nick that he needed to stand up for his rights and told him she knew a lawyer who could help. Nick wasn't sure if he should trust her. His life experience had taught him that such promises often went unfulfilled and that people ultimately turned away. But Haley's determination, her genuine desire to help, and the fact that she had already done more than anyone else had ever done, made him agree. And so that cold night became a turning point in Nick's life. He would never have imagined that someone would step in and help him, especially after so many years of invisibility. For Haley, this evening was also significant. She knew this wasn't just an episode she could forget once she got home. She knew she had to do everything in her power to bring justice for Nick and show that even the most vulnerable members of society deserved respect and fairness. Haley took Nick to a shelter, where he was given a place to stay for the night, and promised him that she would start looking for a lawyer to take on his case the next day. She didn't know how difficult it would be to draw attention to the situation, but she was ready to fight. Nick, lying on the narrow cot in the shelter, felt hope for the first time in a long while. Although the future was uncertain, he knew someone cared about his fate, and that was enough to make him want to fight again. After that night spent in the shelter, Nick still felt the pain in his side from the officer's kick and suffered from emotional exhaustion. He knew that trouble might lie ahead. The fact that Officer Johnson had left him alone for the moment didn't mean he would relinquish his authority. Nick understood that the system, which had been against him for so many years, wouldn't give up so easily. Morning brought new anxieties. He didn't know what awaited him, or if anyone would genuinely be willing to help. Meanwhile, Officer Johnson, back on duty, couldn't stop thinking about that evening. To him, Haley and her intervention were an insult to his authority. He wasn't used to having his actions questioned, especially on the streets where he always felt like the absolute master. He believed this situation required a response, a demonstration that people like Nick had no right to challenge his authority. This belief only grew stronger as Johnson considered how the situation might have looked to others and his colleagues. His ego demanded a reaffirmation of his power, and he decided that Nick needed to be punished. The next day, as Nick tried to find something to eat, Johnson found him again. This time, the officer had a clear goal: to show Nick that the system was always against him and that he had no right to resist. He accused Nick of disturbing the peace and arrested him without even properly explaining the alleged violation. It was merely an assertion of power, a way to show that people like Nick had no rights in this system. When Nick was taken to the police station, he felt the cold detachment of the place. The gray walls, cells with metal bars, and indifferent looks from the officers, all of it seemed to symbolize that he had ceased being a person in the eyes of those around him, reduced to just another case, a homeless nuisance to society. Nick sat in the cell, feeling completely alone and powerless, uncertain of what lay ahead. He had no choice, no opportunity to explain or defend himself. Inside the station, an atmosphere of indifference prevailed. Officers passing by Nick's cell paid him no attention, as if he were merely part of the furniture. To them, his presence meant nothing. Nick knew his fate depended on the whims of people who saw him only as a problem, not as a person. This sense of helplessness was familiar to him. It had been with him every time he tried to find work, every time he was driven away from a place, every time no one wanted to hear his story. But suddenly, just as Nick was preparing to resign himself to spending another night behind bars, he saw a familiar face. Haley had come to the police station. She looked determined, her gaze focused, and she held documents and her phone, which contained the video she had recorded the previous night. Accompanying her was a young man holding a briefcase. This was Amir Carter, a lawyer Haley had found through her contacts. Amir Carter was a man with a strong sense of justice, and when Haley approached him, he immediately agreed to help. He understood that this case wasn't just about one incident, but part of a much larger problem. He knew that people like Nick were far too often subjected to police abuse and unfair treatment, and he was ready to do everything he could to change that. For Amir, this was more than just another case. It was an opportunity to make a stand and take a step toward challenging a system that so often worked against those in need of protection. When Haley and Amir entered the police station, they insisted on meeting with Nick. Their persistence surprised the officers, but they were eventually allowed to speak with the detainee. When Nick saw them, he felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. He couldn't believe someone was truly willing to fight for him. His life had been filled with empty promises, and people disappearing as soon as situations became complicated. Amir explained to Nick that he was determined to do everything possible to help him regain his freedom and defend his rights. Haley held Nick's hand, showing him that he wasn't alone. Nick realized that this pair represented his only chance for justice. He saw that they were people who cared and who were willing to fight despite the pressure and obstacles. Amir immediately began preparing the necessary paperwork and demanded Nick's release, as his arrest was unlawful and unjustified. He used all his knowledge and experience to convince the police that they had no right to detain Nick without evidence. Haley stood by, supporting Nick and recording everything that happened at the station in case it needed to be used later. Nick was released from the cell after several hours of waiting. He still felt disbelief at everything that had happened, unable to fathom that someone had managed to get him out. But seeing the determination of Amir and Haley, he began to realize that there were people willing to fight for him. For Nick, this was an incredible revelation. He was used to being alone, used to the idea that no one cared about people like him. That encounter at the police station became a turning point for Nick. He felt that he no longer wanted to be a silent victim. He was ready to fight, even if his strength was limited, because now he knew he had allies. Amir and Haley had taken the first step on this path, a path that was full of challenges, but Nick now had faith that he wasn't alone and that justice was possible. Thus, the day that began with an arrest and complete despair ended with the unexpected arrival of support and a small but significant victory. Nick was released, and this gave him the strength and determination to start fighting for his rights, and for a life he no longer wanted to leave to the mercy of the system. Nick's release marked a turning point, but he knew it was only the beginning of a long road ahead. He was well aware that the police wouldn't leave him alone, and that Officer Johnson would try in every way to assert his dominance. Though Nick felt relief, he remained vigilant, knowing that many challenges still lay ahead. He understood that his freedom was thanks to Haley and Amir, and this gave him courage. He now had a goal: to fight for justice and ensure such actions wouldn't be repeated. Amir Carter, the lawyer who had taken Nick's case, was an experienced attorney specializing in human rights and defending those often overlooked by the system. For Amir, this was more than just a case of unlawful arrest. He understood that Nick's situation was part of a broader problem tied to systemic injustice and biases against black and homeless individuals. Amir knew that achieving justice for Nick would require taking risks and possibly facing resistance from the police and the department, but he was undeterred. He was ready to fight, leveraging all his resources and connections. The following day, Amir and Haley met with Nick at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Haley had insisted on this meeting because she wanted to convince Nick of the importance of fighting to the end. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but also understood that if they let things stand as they were, Officer Johnson would continue his behavior, and Nick would remain marginalized, without rights or recognition. The cafe had a calm atmosphere: small tables, a few patrons leisurely sipping coffee and reading newspapers. Nick sat at a table, feeling slightly out of place. He was accustomed to judgmental stares, as if his misfortunes were his fault, as if his struggles were a matter of choice. In a cafe where people were dressed in clean, expensive clothing, he felt like an outsider, but Haley and Amir's presence gave him some confidence. Amir laid out the plan to Nick. He explained that he would represent him in court and had already begun preparing the paperwork to file a complaint against Officer Johnson. Amir detailed the need to gather evidence, including the video Haley had recorded and witness testimonies. He also warned Nick that the police department would likely try to discredit him, portraying him in a negative light and using any past mistakes against him. The system would resist because admitting wrongdoing by the police would mean acknowledging the need for change and reform. Nick understood the fight ahead would be tough, but now he was ready for it. Haley sat beside Nick, offering her support and assuring him that they wouldn't abandon him. She recognized that Nick's life had been filled with betrayal and disappointment, making it hard for him to trust anyone's help. She worked to convince him of their sincerity, knowing that people like Nick, often isolated, could lose hope and faith in others. Haley was determined to make him feel supported. Amir gave Nick several recommendations for his behavior in court and how to prepare for the legal process. He stressed the importance of honesty and transparency, advising against hiding anything that could be used against him. Nick listened carefully, feeling his fears and uncertainties gradually replaced by determination. He saw that he had support and realized he was no longer alone in this battle. This thought gave him strength. Nick also understood that his case could set an important precedent. If he succeeded in achieving justice, it might mark the beginning of change, making cases like his treated differently in the future. He knew he was not only representing his own interests, but also those of others who, like him, had been sidelined by society, whose voices went unheard. This added a sense of responsibility, but also bolstered his resolve. Haley, meanwhile, decided not to limit her support to just helping Nick in court. She reached out to local activists and human rights advocates to share Nick's story and raise awareness about the case. She understood that without public attention, Nick's case might be swept under the rug or misrepresented. Haley wanted as many people as possible to know about the injustice and stand by Nick's side. For Haley, this was a matter of principle, not just fighting for Nick, but for all those who faced injustice and were denied a voice. In the days that followed, Nick, Amir, and Haley began preparing for the upcoming trial. Nick met with Amir, answered his questions, and helped gather all the necessary details for the case. He recounted everything that had happened that evening, reliving the humiliation and pain, but now these memories were not just reminders of his helplessness. They became part of his fight for justice. Nick wanted the truth to be heard, and for people like Officer Johnson to understand that abusing power wouldn't go unpunished. For Nick, every day of preparation was a challenge. He had to confront memories he would rather forget and face the realization that the system he was fighting against had far more resources and power than he did. But he knew he wasn't alone this time. He saw Amir's determination and Haley's willingness to fight for him, and this gave him strength. Nick didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to fight. He now had a purpose, not only to seek justice for himself, but also to show that even the most vulnerable members of society could and should be heard. Several weeks had passed since Nick's release from unlawful detention, and together with Amir and Haley, he had been actively preparing for the trial. Time was passing, and they became increasingly aware of the uphill battle they faced against a system that was clearly not on the side of the most vulnerable. But at this stage, as Nick, Haley, and Amir were solidifying their strategy and gathering evidence, an unexpected turn of events gave the case new momentum. Amir Carter was sitting in his office when he heard a knock at the door. The office, a modest space where people often came seeking to defend their rights, had a large table cluttered with papers and a few chairs for clients. At the door stood a man Amir didn't know, but it was immediately clear he was a police officer. It was Michael Smith, an officer who had worked in the same department as Officer Johnson for several years. He looked tense, and it was evident that coming here had been a difficult decision for him. Michael Smith had spent years observing the behavior of his colleagues, including Johnson. He had seen Johnson abuse his power, treating those he considered beneath him with contempt. Smith knew that Johnson often overstepped his authority, and it had always bothered him, but he had remained silent, understanding that speaking out could cost him his job. He had witnessed how the system protected officers like Johnson, covering up their misconduct and justifying their actions in every situation. However, the incident with Nick had been the last straw for Smith. When he learned that Haley had recorded Johnson's actions and that the case had gained public attention, he decided he could no longer stand by. Michael came to Amir's office to give a statement. This decision had not been easy for him. He knew his colleagues would see him as a traitor, that he was risking his career, and that the department would do everything it could to discredit him if he went against one of their own. But Michael also knew that his silence made him complicit in all the injustices he had witnessed. He didn't want people like Nick to continue suffering simply because the system preferred to ignore their plight. He understood that his testimony could be a turning point in Nick's case, and so he took this step. Amir listened intently, careful not to show his surprise. He realized how significant this statement was, and how powerful the testimony of a police officer against one of his colleagues could be. It was a real chance to demonstrate that the issue wasn't limited to Nick's case, but was part of a systemic problem that had been ignored for far too long. Amir proposed that Michael officially give a sworn statement, which he did. Michael described Johnson's behavior, recounting how he had repeatedly witnessed him abusing his power, particularly toward black individuals and other minorities. He spoke about how the department turned a blind eye to such actions, and how anyone who tried to oppose or report such misconduct quickly found themselves isolated, their careers destroyed. It was a powerful testimony, and Amir knew it would strengthen Nick's case. When Haley learned that a witness from within the department had come forward, she felt a sense of relief. It meant their case could no longer be easily dismissed. Michael Smith's appearance gave them an opportunity not only to defend Nick, but also to initiate a broader investigation into the department, its practices, and those who had covered for Johnson. She knew there were still many obstacles ahead, but now their chances had significantly improved. Nick, upon hearing that a police officer was willing to stand up for him, was shocked. He wasn't used to seeing someone from within the system take the side of those it usually oppressed. He understood that Michael was risking his career and personal safety, and he felt deep gratitude for this courageous act. It was confirmation that his case mattered, that his fight was important not only for himself, but also for many others facing injustice. These weeks of preparation became a time of empowerment for Nick. He realized that his voice and his story could make a difference. He saw how Haley and Amir were dedicating their time and energy to his defense, how others were joining the cause, and it gave him resolve. Nick didn't want to remain just a victim. He wanted to be someone who stood up to the system and helped change it. Now that they had Michael Smith's testimony, Amir and his team began preparing for the trial with renewed confidence. They had evidence, witnesses ready to testify, and growing public support. Amir understood that the police would try to exert pressure, that the department wouldn't back down without a fight, but he was ready. He knew this case could set an example for others and potentially be the start of real change. For Nick, the coming days would be decisive. He still lived in a small shelter, grappling with anxiety and uncertainty, but every day of preparation brought him closer to the moment when he could stand in court and tell his story. He knew it would be painful to relive everything that had happened, to once again face the humiliation and hurt, but now he had a purpose, to seek justice not just for himself, but for everyone in similar situations. These events, and the unexpected witness from the department, gave Nick the strength to keep fighting. He didn't know how this journey would end, but he was ready to see it through to the end. The trial began several weeks after Nick's case had garnered public attention. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, friends, and even strangers who had been moved by Nick's story came to support him. On the other side of the courtroom sat representatives from the police department and their attorneys, determined to defend the honor and authority of law enforcement at any cost. The police department opened by attempting to discredit Nick, portraying him as a potentially dangerous individual. Their lawyers pointed to his homeless status and past minor arrests, arguing that Nick was unfit to adapt to society and a source of problems for the community. They tried to paint a picture of a man who was a threat to those around him and undeserving of protection. Every word directed against Nick was carefully calculated. The attorneys sought to convince the court and jury that Nick was just another undesirable, solely responsible for his misfortunes. They aimed to depict him as a delinquent who could never reintegrate into society. For them, this case was about preserving the good name of the police department and justifying Officer Johnson's actions. Nick's attorney, Amir Carter, was prepared for such attacks. He began by presenting the video footage recorded by Haley. This video became the cornerstone of Nick's case. It clearly showed Officer Johnson abusing his authority, insulting, and using force against a man who posed no threat. It was a stark example of how those in power could misuse it for personal reasons, with no fear of consequences. The video made a strong impression on the courtroom, forcing many to reconsider their perceptions of the incident. Amir also brought Officer Michael Smith to the stand to testify. Smith spoke confidently about what he had long known regarding Johnson's behavior. He confirmed that this was not an isolated incident of abuse. He recounted how many of Johnson's colleagues were aware of his aggressive tendencies, especially toward vulnerable groups, but chose not to intervene out of fear for their careers. Smith's testimony lent significant weight to Nick's case, demonstrating that the issue with Officer Johnson was part of a broader problem within the police department. Next, it was Nick's turn to take the stand. He began by sharing his story, starting from the days when he had a job and a stable life. Nick spoke about how losing his job led to losing his home, leaving him on the streets with no safety or support. He described his attempts to find work, to return to a normal life, and the obstacles he encountered at every step. When Nick recounted the day Officer Johnson attacked him, his voice was filled with emotion. He spoke of the fear and humiliation he felt as Johnson approached him with clear aggression. He described how the officer threatened him, how it felt as if his very existence was being erased, as though his life held no value. He detailed the blows he received and how helpless he felt in that moment. His words were simple but honest, and they resonated deeply with everyone in the courtroom. Nick didn't try to present himself as a hero. He simply wanted to tell his truth, and that left a profound impact on everyone present. During his testimony, Nick didn't just speak about his pain and despair. He also spoke about the hope he felt when Haley intervened to help him. He described how, as he lay on the ground, feeling completely abandoned, Haley's actions restored his belief that his life still had meaning. He emphasized that people like Haley and Michael Smith made him realize that even in the darkest circumstances, support could be found, and that fighting for one's rights was essential, despite fear and uncertainty. Nick's testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. His honest and emotional words shattered the narrative of bias the police department's attorneys had tried to create. Nick presented himself not as a delinquent or a problematic homeless man, but as someone simply trying to survive in a world that had left him no other choice. He didn't ask for pity, he sought justice, and that caused many in the courtroom to rethink their views of him. When it came time for closing arguments, Amir Carter emphasized that this case was not just about the unlawful arrest of one man. It was about how the system ignored the rights of the most vulnerable, and how no one, regardless of their social status, should fall victim to abuse by those meant to protect them. He highlighted that Johnson's actions were part of a larger systemic issue, and that a fair verdict was necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. The trial was intense, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence. But despite the police department's efforts to cast Nick in a negative light, the testimonies, the video footage, and Nick's own words made a powerful impact on the court. The decision was now in the hands of the jury, and everyone waited anxiously for their verdict. Nick, Amir, and Haley knew the road had been long and difficult, and they didn't know what the outcome would be. But they also knew they had done everything possible to make the truth heard. Nick was no longer a voiceless, powerless individual. He had become a voice for those the system had ignored for too long, and that in itself was already a victory. The trial lasted several weeks, and every minute of those hearings felt endless to Nick. He sat in the courtroom, nervously listening as the police department's attorneys tried to portray him in the worst possible light. The defense spared no effort in undermining his hope for justice. But now, the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived, the time for the verdict. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, friends, and supporters who had stood by Nick throughout this arduous journey filled the space. Haley and Amir sat beside him, each feeling a mixture of fear about the potential outcome and confidence that they had done everything possible to prove Nick's innocence. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone held their breath, awaiting the jury's decision. When the judge entered the room and called everyone to rise, a hush fell over the crowd. The jury had reached its decision, and the judge began to read the verdict. Every breath, every movement in the courtroom felt almost tangible. Nick sat with his head bowed, his fingers clasped tightly, trying his best to hide his anxiety. Amir placed a reassuring hand on Nick's shoulder, while Haley stared at the judge with a look of resolute determination. After long and grueling hearings, the verdict was announced. Officer Johnson was found guilty of abuse of power and assaulting Nick. The decision felt like liberation for Nick, like a thunderclap, breaking through the oppressive silence. The court acknowledged that Johnson had acted with bias and aggression, abusing his authority to harm a man who posed no threat. The jury agreed that Nick had been a victim of systemic racism and police misconduct. The decision sparked a wave of emotion in the courtroom. Amir embraced Nick, and Haley couldn't hold back her tears, overwhelmed with the realization that their fight had borne fruit. Many in the room erupted in applause, expressing their support and joy for Nick. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a win for everyone who had ever faced injustice at the hands of the police, but lacked the means to fight back. The verdict showed that, however slowly, the system was capable of acknowledging its mistakes and taking steps to rectify them. Officer Johnson was temporarily suspended from duty, and an internal investigation into his actions was announced. This meant that, beyond the court's punishment, Johnson could face disciplinary measures and possibly lose his position within the department. For Nick, this was a significant victory, a sign that his voice, and the voices of many others, mattered, and that their struggle could yield results. After the verdict was delivered, Amir and Haley helped Nick leave the courtroom. Outside, the street was crowded with reporters and supporters who had gathered to express their solidarity. Nick felt as though he was dreaming. He had never imagined that his story would reach so many people, that his voice would be heard. He had been just a man trying to survive in circumstances that forced him to fight every day. But now he had become a symbol of the fight for justice, an example that even the most vulnerable could achieve the truth. Amir, standing by his side, spoke to journalists, explaining that Nick's case was just the beginning and that there was much work to be done to reform the justice system and ensure the protection of everyone's rights. He knew this case wouldn't solve all the problems, but he was confident that it was an important step toward a better future. Haley, in turn, emphasized the importance of supporting those who face injustice, highlighting that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves dignity and respect. Nick, though feeling a bit overwhelmed by the surge of attention and emotion, knew that everything happening around him was the result of their collective fight. He was deeply grateful to Haley for stepping in that day when Johnson had tried to break him, and to Amir for his relentless pursuit of justice. He knew that without their help, he would never have achieved such a result. For Nick, the verdict wasn't just the end of a long legal battle. It was the beginning of a new life in which he was no longer a silent victim, but a person who had stood up to the system and achieved justice. The journey had been filled with pain, doubt, and fear, but it had also been filled with support, love, and solidarity from those who chose to stand by him. From that day forward, Nick promised himself that he would continue to fight for himself and others. He decided to use his experience and his story to help people in similar situations, to show them that despite all the challenges, their voices mattered and that truth and justice could prevail if they fought for them to the very end. After the trial, Nick's life changed dramatically. With the compensation awarded by the court for the harm he had suffered, he was able to rent a small room in an old but cozy house on the outskirts of the city. For Nick, it felt like reclaiming a part of himself. The room was bright, with a large window that let in warm sunlight in the mornings and a soft glow from the streetlights at night. It became his sanctuary, a symbol of independence and a fresh start. For the first time in years, Nick felt secure, knowing he had a place where he could sleep peacefully without fear of being thrown out or humiliated. Given the chance to rebuild his life, Nick decided he couldn't just sit idly by. He wanted to be useful, to do something meaningful. So he accepted an offer to work with a charitable organization that supported people facing tough circumstances. The organization helped the homeless, like Nick once was, providing food, clothing, temporary shelter, and assistance with finding jobs and reintegrating into society. Working at the foundation was challenging and sometimes exhausting, but it brought Nick profound satisfaction. He saw the same fear and despair in others' eyes that he had once felt himself, and he understood how crucial it was to have someone there to support you without judgment. Nick helped distribute food, advised people on finding work, and listened to their stories. He felt he was making a meaningful contribution, using his own experiences to help others. He witnessed individuals who had been on the brink of despair begin to believe in themselves again, and this gave him the strength to keep going. One of the most important aspects of Nick's work at the foundation was mentoring young people who found themselves on the streets. Nick understood that youth were particularly vulnerable. They could easily fall prey to bad decisions or negative influences. He strove to be the mentor he had once sought but never found. He shared his story with them, not to elicit pity, but to show them that even in the darkest situations there was always a way out, and that those who seemed at their lowest could find the strength to rise and fight back. The foundation also allowed Nick to meet new people, others like himself, who had faced injustice and managed to overcome it. He became part of a community of individuals who refused to give up in the face of hardship, and this community became a new family for him. For the first time in years, Nick felt he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by support and understanding. Haley and Amir continued to be an important part of his life. Haley, the first person to reach out and help him, had become a close friend. She often visited the foundation, helped distribute food, organized fundraisers, and always made time to talk to Nick. Together, they laughed, reminisced about the difficult times, and dreamed about the future. For Nick, Haley symbolized the existence of people who fought for others, even when they had no obligation to do so. Amir, on the other hand, was more than just a lawyer to Nick. He was a mentor and a role model. He continued to support Nick, sharing his wisdom and advising him on how best to approach various situations. They became friends, and Nick deeply valued that friendship. Amir saw potential in Nick and often emphasized that his experiences and desire to help others could change lives. It was Amir who inspired Nick to keep striving for more. Nick decided that his work at the foundation was only the beginning. He wanted to do more, to ensure his voice was heard, and to let others in similar situations know they weren't alone. He began participating in public events, sharing his story at gatherings and conferences dedicated to human rights and police reform. He actively collaborated with advocacy groups fighting for the rights of the homeless and those who had suffered from police misconduct. Nick was no longer the homeless man hiding from the police, struggling to survive on the streets. He had become a symbol of the fight for justice, an example that even when it seems all is lost, it's possible to find strength and stand up for your rights. He no longer felt broken or humiliated. Instead, he was someone who could help others, someone who could show that life could change if you didn't give up and kept fighting. Through his work with the foundation, Nick found renewed purpose and meaning in his life. He was no longer invisible. His story was known, and it gave him the chance to make the world a little better. He understood that he couldn't change the entire system, but he believed that every small action mattered, and he resolved to dedicate his life to helping others, ensuring that anyone in difficult circumstances knew there were people willing to support and help them. The trial and its victory had given Nick the chance to feel like a person with dignity and the right to respect. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, that his journey was just beginning, but he was ready to face them. Nick had found his place in the world and was determined to use his story to help others. His life had taken on new meaning, and he walked this new path with his head held high, knowing he was no longer the lost and lonely man he had once been. He was someone who had triumphed and someone who was ready to fight for others.